Sharifi, lecturer at the Department of Linguistics and president of the Kurdish American Education Society. From the very outset, let me express my profound gratitude to our distinguished guests for accepting wholeheartedly to be a part of this timely forum during a critical time. I also appreciate the co-sponsorship of multiple departments and student associations on campus, including anthropology, Middle Eastern studies, political science, journalism and mass communication, geography, international studies, multicultural center, Persian Student Association, History Student Association, Anthropology Student Association, and Anthropology Graduate Student Association. Hopefully I did not skip. Some of us may wonder why this forum, and why is it significant after all? All of us to different degrees are aware of the gravity and colossal tragedy that is plaguing both Syria and Iraq in a series of deepening and intractable crises. And all this is a departure from and degeneration of the collective call for political transformation and democratization in the Middle East that began with the so-called Arab Spring, and some people call it Kurdish awakening. Our ability to understand what appears to be murky and mysterious depends on our knowledge of the shifting political landscape. Both Iraq and Syria are now entangled in senseless acts of sectarian violence and in competing confluence of internal-external conflicts between state and non-state actors, all clashing for hegemonic rule in an area that has historically been one of the cultural hubs of ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity. The timing of this forum reminds us of an uncertain and precarious future. The Islamic State is threatening any semblance of peace and stability. ISIS, with its pernicious ideology, has brought an endless trail of deaths, displacements, and destructions. More recently, Kurds have borne the brunt of ISIS' genocidal war. The Kurdish Yazidis, followers of an ancient Mesopotamian religion in North Iraq, have escaped their historical homeland from the ruthless onslaught and
incredibly heightened tensions between religious and ethnic groups, and highlighted for people throughout the Middle East and the world that the United States was willing to go to any length to get oil.
Kurdish fighters dressed in traditional clothing lead a rally in Erbil in support of the war effort against IS. But once the Kurds no longer feel threatened, the ruling Kurdish Democratic Party plans for complete independence from Iraq. Hemen Haurami is a KDP leader.
Kurdish independence and self-determination right is our God-given natural right. We are not Arabs, we are not Turks, we are just another nation. The self-determination rights is something, it's an eternal matter of Kurdistan, and we can no longer be hostage of unknown future.
To better understand the complicated wars in Iraq and Syria, let's go back a few years. In early 2011, people throughout the Middle East rose up in the Arab Spring. I visited Tunisia and saw this sculpture commemorating the street vendor who immolated himself, the event that sparked the uprising. Here's a huge poster of him in his hometown. Mass demonstrations in Egypt overthrew the hated dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak, and it looked like Bashar al-Assad in Syria was next. But the Assad regime used a combination of clever propaganda and brutal repression to stay in power. Syrians turned to armed struggle, and most recently, ultra-right-wing militias have gained influence. They use Islam as their excuse to impose a new dictatorship. Some Syrians, such as Alawites and Shia Muslims, back Assad as the lesser evil. Here, Shia Muslims go to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and others pray at the Ruqayya Shrine. Syrian Christians also tend to support Assad, fearing for their future if ultra-right-wing Muslim groups come to power. Here, Christian leaders gathered at a funeral for children killed by rebel rockets. The civil war has had a disastrous impact on Syria's economy, driving up inflation and unemployment. Here, Syrians in the city of Aleppo wait in line for bread. The famous Damascus souk, or bazaar, is almost empty on some days. Tourism, once a mainstay of the economy, has disappeared. Foreign powers now play an increasingly dominant role in the civil war. At Friday prayers in Tehran, Iranian leaders proclaimed their full military support for Assad. The US and Saudi Arabia back the rebels. Here on the Golan Heights, a local Arab resident stands just yards from the Israeli-Syrian border. Israel seized the Golan from Syria in 1967, and all Syrians want its return. Israel covertly provides military support for Syrian rebels. Inside Syria, the backstory of their civil war and what the world can expect explains these and many other issues in greater detail. This Yazidi woman and her 2-day-old... Sorry about that. Shall I just close it? All right. Okay, so on to the quiz. Which 2 photos did I not shoot? Picture of Assad. Nope, that was, I interviewed him in 2006. I shot that myself. Sometimes people say the Tehran prayer, Friday prayers, but I shot that as well. Yes?
Those grainy images in the middle with the armed guy?
Yeah, that's it. It's the 2 photos of the armed rebels that were lifted off of YouTube. But other than that, I had shot all of them. By the way, you guys, you got it on the 3rd try. Stanford, it took them 5 times, so you beat them by 2. Probably the best way to understand what's currently going on in the Middle East is to come with me to visit some of the cities that I did my reporting from both recently and in the recent past. Let's start at Fishkapur, which is a city or a small town on the Syrian-Iraqi border where those photos were shot of the Yazidis, and we heard about it from the previous speaker. The Islamic State went on an offensive in July, overran the city of Mosul and nearby towns. People have fled in the tens or indeed hundreds of thousands. And the Kurdish regional government was overwhelmed with the refugee crisis, and it's still a problem down to this day. And I visited the Barzani Institute that had set up, or foundation I should say, that had set up refugee camps, providing food. The churches of Erbil and other cities were providing help for Iraqi Christians fleeing the onslaught. And what I found from interviewing the refugees and others is that what the Islamic State is an evil war criminal organization, but what it's doing is perfectly logical from its own standpoint. It knows that it cannot rule an area that has large numbers of minorities or political opponents. So what it was doing in attacking the Yazidis, the Christians, Shia Muslims, and others, was seeking to kill some and drive the rest out, a process of ethnic cleansing that we've seen happen in other parts of the world. And by doing that, they were trying to clear a space in the middle of Iraq, if you will, and in the northern part of Syria, where they could impose their new dictatorship using Islam as the excuse. I don't think I need to elaborate in any great detail for an audience like this, but what the Islamic State is, the biggest misnomer there is it's neither Islamic nor a state. They take Islam, they take a few quotes from the Quran, they distort it, and then they use it as a means to impose their own new dictatorship of Muslim capitalism with the most ultra right-wing kind. And they are no more representative of Islam than the people who murder abortion doctors who do so in the name of Christianity represent Christian religion. So if there's further questions on that, I'll be happy to go into it later. We can next go to Erbil, the capital of the Iraqi Kurdistan, and I had a chance to visit and interview American diplomats, Peshmerga leaders, which is the Kurdish military, and leaders of the various Kurdish political parties. And in those sets of interviews, I figured out what the official explanation is for the current US bombing in both Syria and Iraq. The bombing, if you recall, began in August in northern Iraq with the argument that the US was stopping the slaughter of Yazidis, it was stopping the overrunning of Kurdistan, and it was protecting US military personnel who were in Erbil. Those were the three official reasons. Well, within a matter of weeks, the Yazidi crisis had ended. The people who left had left. Those who chose to stay stayed. Yet the bombing intensified. The question of the military personnel was a phony issue from the beginning. The airports were always open. It was possible to evacuate those American diplomats or military within 24 hours. In fact, they didn't do it. Some left, but more came as they ramped up the military actions. And as far as Kurdistan is concerned, there was no chance that the Islamic State was going to overrun and occupy Kurdistan for the same reasons as I talked about before. They're not stupid. They know they can't occupy and try to govern an area where the entire population is hostile to them, because there's virtually no Kurds that are supportive of the Islamic State. Now, they could have caused military damage. They could have fired mortars and rockets into Erbil or other places. They could have caused a lot of political instability, but that's different from saying that they were going to be overrun by the Islamic State. So in order to understand if those official reasons were not the real reasons, what were they? Let's go to the city of Kirkuk. I drove there on the last trip. For many years I had wanted to go to Kirkuk, but it was impossible because it was technically part of Iraq, and you crossed a border between Kurdistan and Iraq, and you needed a special visa and journalist permission to travel there. But now it's open, easily traveled from Erbil, about an hour's drive, because the Kurdish Peshmerga took it over in July of this year. And in order to understand what was going on there, I wanted to visit the oil fields of Kirkuk. They're famous. In 1927, they were the first oil fields in the Arab world, discovered by the British. They set up an American, British, and French oil company to exploit the oil. And various governments since then have been closely cooperative, let's say, with the oil industry in Kirkuk and later in other parts of Iraq. And I hired a fixer to take me out to the oil fields. A fixer is journalistic lingo for somebody who arranges interviews, perhaps translates. And this guy was a magazine photographer. And he drove us out to the oil fields. And as dusk was falling, it wasn't quite dark yet, I saw this enormous flame in the distance on the horizon. It's the largest open flame I've ever seen in my life. It turns out it's the flaring of the natural gas off the oil wells. And as you probably know, when you drill for oil, natural gas comes off. Normally you try to cap it and burn it for energy. But in this case, it's just flared and burned off in the atmosphere. It's very damaging environmentally, and of course they're quite a waste in terms of energy. But the oil companies and the Iraqi government had never gotten around to capping that flame. It's now a landmark, and apparently it's been burning since the 1930s. So as we're talking about this history of oil and the negative impact it's had on the people of Kirkuk, because they have not seen, certainly the well-to-do foreigners and the top elite of the Iraqi governments have done well, but the ordinary people of Kirkuk have not seen a lot of that wealth. And my fixer just broke out in song. He started singing in Kurdish. And the song was so well known that my other fixer was traveling with me. He joined in and they started singing it as well. And I said, well, what's the song that you're singing? It's a song, it's a lament about the curse of oil for the people of Kirkuk. In other words, it's so well known that the damaging impact of the oil industry that people write songs about it. And one of the lyrics is, maybe we would have been better off if oil hadn't been discovered at all. And if you really want to understand what the US current war is about, you have to set aside the official justifications of humanitarian intervention, etc.
a core reason, not the only one, but a core reason is oil. The U.S., when it invaded in Iraq in 2003, the plan was to privatize the oil industry, make sure the U.S. and British oil companies got the majority of the contracts, and to make sure that Iran, Russia, China didn't get the oil contracts. Well, it didn't work out that way. Part of the fact that the U.S. lost the war in Iraq was the fact that they didn't end up controlling the oil industry. There are U.S. oil companies there, but not exclusively and not predominantly. Meanwhile, the medium-sized U.S. And other foreign oil companies started drilling in northern Iraq in the Kurdish region, and that's an issue that's continues to be in flux, and I'm going to mention in a moment that just yesterday there seemed to be a settlement to that issue. So one of the main reasons for the U.S. interest strategically is control of the region's oil, not only just in Iraq, which has the third largest oil supplies in the world, Kurdistan, which has the 9th largest, according to Kurdish officials. Iran nearby is the 3rd largest, or the 2nd largest, I should say, and nearby Saudi Arabia is the largest of reserves in the world. So it's not only a question of who controls Iraq and Syria, but the neighbors and the impact of Iraqi oil on the region. The second reason is military bases. The U.S. was forced to close its military bases in Iraq at the end of 2011. The U.S. was never happy about that. One of the things we're doing now is reestablishing those bases by sending back in troops. That's clearly another factor. And the third factor is geopolitical. The U.S. wants to have a pro-U.S. government in power in Baghdad. And one of the preliminary demands to start the bombing and to stop the IS was that the al-Maliki government resign and another government come into power. And that's exactly what happened. The U.S., I know this may come as a shock, but the U.S. lost the war in Iraq. I know the U.S. doesn't lose wars, so maybe that's not possible, but if you look at it in any objective reality, we lost the war in Iraq. The government, the U.S. was forced to pull out all of its troops at the end of 2011 and closed all its military bases. And the government in Baghdad is more favorable to Iran than to the United States. That's a pretty good definition of defeat. And despite the billions, indeed trillions of dollars spent on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. has lost one and is in the process of losing the other. Now, in order to kind of understand a bit more of the background to the other countries in the region and what their goals are and where they stand, we have to go to the city of Sulaymaniyah. Sulaymaniyah is the 2nd largest city in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I visited there on a previous trip, and I stayed in an old Saddam Hussein era hotel. It was concrete blocks covered over with concrete, painted gray. As far as I can tell, the beds were made out of concrete. It was like a 1-star hotel where the star had fallen off. It was pretty rough accommodations. But the reason I stayed there is because downstairs there was a tea house. And every morning, to drink tea, a bunch of people gathered from various countries around the world. They were diplomats, journalists, and spies. And it was a great place for me to meet people and to set up interviews. But first I had to understand how to drink the tea. Now, those of you who are from the region or have traveled there will know exactly what I'm talking about, because in that part of the world, tea is made by, you have a small glass, no handle, no cup holder. It's just a small glass with an indentation. And you put about 3 teaspoons of sugar in the bottom, strong black tea leaves, and boiling hot water. So you've got really strong, really hot, really sweet tea that you stir up with a little spoon. But how do you drink it? Because if you hold it like this way, the steam comes up and burns the palm of your hand. And if you hold it this way, it's too hot even by the lip, and hold it by the lip. So I was not going to be deterred. I'm an investigative journalist, or travel around the world. So I looked around the room to see how everybody else was doing it, right? And the way most people were drinking it was you pour off some into your saucer, and then you let it cool, and you look to the left to see who's spying on you from the left, and then you look to the right and see who's spying on you from the right. And I would make eye contact and arch my eyebrows, and So, you know, and that's the way I got my interviews set up, and my fixer would go over and we'd chat and I'd get some interviews. And I got some great insights from this trip to Sulmania and in my subsequent trips about what are the real interests of the various people of the region, because everybody has their own goal for what they want the United States to do. Everyone has their own long-term goal of what they'd like to do. And those two things often don't coincide. And none of them have anything to do with the best interests of the people of the United States, an issue that's often left out of this discussion, and all this great discussion of strategic goals and strategic oil reserves and so on. So let me start with the question of the Kurds. As you probably know, the Kurds have a long history of being of oppression and repression in the four countries they live in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And they have been promised self-determination after World War I. That promise was reneged on. They have faced horrific attacks, including the use of poison gas by Saddam Hussein, and they certainly have a right to self-determination. The question of when and how to exercise that and what kind of state would emerge, that's a question that's very much up for grabs today. And when the Islamic State attacked and took over Mosul and some nearby cities, the Kurdish regional government also expanded its territory by 40%, and including taking over the city of Kirkuk, which had been nominally under the control of the Iraqi government. So the Kurds, certainly the main ruling party, the KDP, or the Kurdish Democratic Party, was on a march towards independence. They had announced plans for a referendum to hold a vote. If the vote was held, for sure people would have voted for independence. And when the Islamic State attacked, it certainly set that back. Now what's very interesting is just yesterday there was an agreement signed between the Kurdish leadership and the government in Baghdad to allow, that may lessen the likelihood of immediate independence, because the Iraqi government will recognize the right of Kurdistan to develop and ship its own oil, and will restore the money that had been held back. They're supposed to receive a certain percentage of the national budget, and in turn the Kurdish authorities have agreed not to try and sell their oil independently, but to go through the national oil company. So that we'll see, because these kind of agreements all hinge on how they're actually carried out in practice. But that could be a positive step forward to defusing the question of whether Kurdistan would seek immediate independence. Another group that some spies that I interviewed in Sulmania were from Turkey. And the Turks have a very interesting and contradictory role to play here, because they're supposed to be part of the coalition joined with the United States in fighting the Islamic State. But they're much more interested in getting rid of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, than they are getting rid of the Islamic State. They see the Islamic State as bad guys, but they are much more concerned about Bashar al-Assad. And of course, they're very worried about the Kurds, because there's a group called the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, in Turkey that's been fighting for 30 plus years for greater autonomy and greater Kurdish rights. They're labeled a terrorist organization, and they're labeled by both the United States and by Turkey. The irony, of course, is that the people in Kobani, the city I'm sure you've heard of along the Turkish border, the people who are fighting against the Islamic State there are an affiliate of the PKK. So the U.S. is arming and sending ammunition and supplies to a group that it considers to be a terrorist group. So once again, you have each player in the area has its goals, and the U.S. is trying to cobble together a policy, basically kind of almost making it up as they go. Because you recall, 1 year ago, a little over a year ago, the U.S. was prepared to bomb Assad and his army because of the issue of chemical weapons. Today, we're bombing his worst enemy. And Assad is very pleased with that, because the Islamic State is getting hit both by his forces and by the Americans. And he's also able to attack other rebel groups in Syria with impunity, while the U.S. is focused on the Islamic State. So the final contradiction comes down to this. The United States is engaged in yet another war in Iraq to try and correct all the problems from the last time we lost the war. it's engaged in a new campaign of bombing in Syria. There's nobody in Arab Iraq or in Syria who can fight on the ground to take over and hold these cities. So that means, and no, there's no allies from other countries as well. That means increased escalation by the United States. We've already sent 3,000 troops into Iraq. That's going to increase, I predict. The cost is an estimated $5 billion for just this year alone. Those costs are going to skyrocket. And we're going to see, once again, a disastrous war that could have been prevented from the beginning. And I'm actually optimistic in the sense that I think the people in the medium and the long run, I think the people of the Middle East are perfectly capable of resolving these issues themselves. It will take time, it's complicated, but people of the Middle East resolving their own problems without U.S. military intervention is going to produce a far better solution than any more bombings and reoccupation of Iraq. Thank you, and with that, thank you very much.